Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Before the ideas begin, a small request: most of you who watch are not subscribed, and we've noticed this in the numbers, in the gap between views and the audience that stays. We post every single day, we put care into each script, each thought, each question that unfolds in the dark, and if these videos have become part of your nights, if they help you think or drift, or simply exist in that space between waking and sleep, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, turning on notifications so you know when the next one arrives. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from. What philosophical question occupies your mind the most? What idea you return to when everything else falls away? These small gestures matter more than you might think. They allow this work to continue. They allow these ideas to reach others like you, scattered across the world, awake in the quiet hours. Now the introduction ends and the philosophy begins. Privacy might be accident, might be the result of biological shielding rather than fundamental law, might be the consequence of frequencies that consciousness operates on, being inaccessible to ordinary perception, but not inaccessible in principle, not impossible to detect, not inherently private, but only contingently private, only hidden because the mechanisms for detection have not evolved, have not been developed, have not been made accessible to awareness. And the awareness that some claim to have, that schizophrenics report, that people experiencing psychosis describe, might not be delusion, but might be the temporary or permanent loss of the shielding, the opening of the channels that are normally closed, the reception of signals that are normally filtered out. And the filtering is what protects privacy, is what keeps thoughts hidden, is what ensures that consciousness remains internal, but the internal might not be as secure as it seems, might not be as absolute as is assumed, might be vulnerable to detection, to interception, to the kind of broadcasting that paranoid individuals fear, and that psychiatric diagnosis dismisses as impossible, as symptom, as the misattribution of internal events to external sources. But what if the misattribution is correct? What if the internal events are external? What if thoughts are not confined to the skull, but are radiating outward on frequencies that some can detect, that some are sensitive to, that some cannot avoid detecting, and the detecting is experienced as hearing voices, as receiving transmissions, as being unable to stop the influx of thoughts that are not one's own, but are coming from others, from the environment, from the field of consciousness that might be shared rather than private, that might be collective rather than individual, that might be accessible to those whose shielding has failed, whose filters have broken, whose sensitivity has increased beyond the normal range. And the normal range is what most people experience, is the condition where thoughts feel private, feel internal, feel like they belong to the self and are not accessible to others. But this feeling might be illusion, might be the result of limited sensitivity, might be the consequence of biological constraints that prevent the detection of signals that are actually present, actually broadcasting, actually available to anyone with the right equipment, the right sensitivity, the right frequency. And the frequency is what matters, is what determines whether thoughts are visible or invisible, whether consciousness is private or public, whether the mind is sealed or permeable. And the permeable is what some experience, is what schizophrenics describe, is what people in psychosis report. And the reports are consistent, are describing the same phenomena across cultures, across time periods, across individuals who have no contact with each other. And the consistency is troubling, is suggesting that maybe the experiences are not entirely subjective, are not entirely generated by malfunctioning brains, but are detecting something real, something that is normally filtered out, something that exists in the environment, in the field, in the frequencies where consciousness operates. And the operating might be electromagnetic, might be quantum, might be something that physics has not yet characterized, but that biology is sensitive to, that nervous systems are tuned to, that brains are receiving and transmitting constantly, and the transmitting is what creates the possibility of thought broadcasting, is what makes privacy contingent rather than absolute, is what suggests that the experience of having thoughts that are one's own, that are hidden from others, that are safe from detection, might be the result of anatomical luck, might be the consequence of having filters that work, having shielding that holds, having a nervous system that is tuned to the right frequency and is not picking up the signals that are all around, that are being broadcast by every other conscious being, and the beings are transmitting without knowing, are radiating thoughts without intending, are creating a field of consciousness that is dense, that is crowded, that is full of signals that most cannot detect, but that some can, that some are cursed to detect, that some experience as invasion, as the loss of privacy, as the horrifying realization that thoughts are not safe, are not hidden, are not private, and the not private is what thought broadcasting delusion describes, is what paranoia is responding to, is what might be accurate perception rather than misperception, might be the detection of real signals rather than the hallucination of imaginary ones. And the imaginary is what psychiatry assumes, is what diagnosis requires, is the framework that treats all claims of thought broadcasting as symptoms of disorder, as evidence of psychosis, as the malfunctioning of the reality testing apparatus. But reality testing assumes knowledge of what reality is, assumes that the normal experience is the accurate experience, assumes that privacy is real, and that any perception of its violation is false. And the false might be the assumption, might be the belief that thoughts are private, might be the conviction that consciousness is sealed, when really consciousness is leaking, is broadcasting, is detectable to those who have the sensitivity. And the sensitivity is what varies, is what creates the spectrum, is what makes some people receivers and others transmitters, and most people neither. Most people shielded, most people operating on frequencies that do not overlap with others, that do not allow detection, that maintain the illusion of privacy. And the illusion is functional, is necessary, is what makes social life possible, because if everyone could detect everyone else's thoughts, then interaction would be impossible, would be overwhelming, would be the constant influx of signals that would drown out the ability to think, to focus, to maintain the sense of being an individual consciousness. And the individual is what privacy creates, is what shielding allows, is what makes the experience of being a separate self possible. And the separate might be illusion, might be the result of limited perception, might be what happens when the field of consciousness is filtered down to the signals that originate in one body, in one nervous system, in one brain. And the brain is creating the illusion of separation by filtering out everything else, by attending only to internal signals, by ignoring or suppressing the external signals that are always present, always available, always broadcasting. And the broadcasting is what some cannot ignore, cannot suppress, cannot filter out. And these are the ones who experience thought broadcasting, who hear voices, who feel that their privacy has been violated, and the violation might be real, might be the accurate perception that thoughts are not private, that consciousness is not sealed, that the mind is permeable to signals from the environment, from other minds, from the field that connects all consciousness. And the connecting is what thought broadcasting implies, is what the delusion is pointing toward, is the possibility that minds are not isolated but are networked, are not separate but are overlapping, are not private but are accessible to each other on frequencies that most cannot detect. And the detection is what would make privacy impossible, would make thought visible, would make consciousness public. And the public is what some are experiencing, is what some are reporting, is what psychiatry is dismissing as impossible, as symptom, as the product of malfunctioning brains. But what if the brains are not malfunctioning, but are functioning too well, are too sensitive, are detecting signals that are real but are normally filtered out. And the filtering is what fails in psychosis, is what breaks in schizophrenia, is what allows the influx of thoughts that are not one's own, that are coming from others, that are being broadcast on frequencies that are normally inaccessible. And the inaccessible is what protects privacy, is what makes thoughts feel safe, is what creates the illusion that the mind is sealed, is private, is hidden from others. And the hidden might be temporary, might be contingent, might be the result of biological constraints that could be overcome, could be bypassed, could be eliminated through technology, through drugs, through practices that alter consciousness, that change sensitivity, that open the channels that are normally closed. And the opening is what some experience spontaneously, is what happens in psychosis, is what occurs when the filters fail. And the failing might not be pathological, but might be the revealing of a truth that is normally hidden, that is normally suppressed, that is incompatible with social functioning, but is accurate, is real, is showing that thoughts are not private, that consciousness is not individual, that the mind is part of a field that is shared, that is collective, that is accessible to anyone who has the sensitivity. And the sensitivity is what varies, is what creates the spectrum, is what determines whether thoughts are experienced as private or as public, as hidden or as visible, as safe or as vulnerable. And the vulnerable is what thought broadcasting feels like, is what the experience is the sense that privacy has been lost, that thoughts are exposed, that the mind is transparent to others. And the transparency might be real, might be accurate, might be the perception of a frequency where thoughts become visible, where consciousness is no longer hidden, where the illusion of privacy dissolves, and the dissolving is terrifying, is overwhelming, is experienced as invasion, as violation, as the loss of the boundary that makes the self feel separate, feel protected, feel safe. And the safety is what privacy provides, is what shielding creates, is what most people have and some people lack. And the lacking is what makes thought broadcasting possible, is what opens the channels, is what allows detection. And the detection is not imagined, but is real, is accurate, is perceiving signals that are present, that are broadcasting, that are coming from other minds. And the other minds are not aware that they are broadcasting, are not intending to transmit, are not trying to communicate, are just existing, just thinking, just being conscious. And the consciousness is radiating, is emitting signals, is creating a field that some can detect, that some are sensitive to, that some experience as voices, as thoughts that are not their own, as the influx of consciousness from outside, and the outside is everywhere, is surrounding, is the environment of minds that are all broadcasting, all transmitting, all creating signals that are normally filtered out, but that some can detect. And the detecting is what schizophrenics are doing, is what people in psychosis are experiencing, is what thought broadcasting is. And the broadcasting is real, is not delusion, is not symptom, is the accurate perception of a frequency where thoughts become visible, where consciousness is detectable, where privacy is lost. And the lost is what some experience, is what some report, is what psychiatry dismisses. But the dismissing might be wrong, might be the refusal to acknowledge a truth that is too disturbing, too threatening, too incompatible with the belief that thoughts are private, that minds are sealed, that consciousness is individual. And the individual might be illusion, might be the result of shielding, might be what most people experience because their filters work, because their sensitivity is limited, because they are operating on frequencies that do not overlap with others, and the others are there, are broadcasting, are detectable to those who have the sensitivity. And the sensitivity is what the Soviets were researching, is what psychic warfare experiments were trying to exploit, is what programs like M-Cultura were investigating, is the possibility that thoughts can be detected, can be influenced, can be transmitted and received. And the receiving is what some can do naturally, is what schizophrenics are experiencing, is what thought broadcasting is describing, and the describing is accurate, is real, is perceiving signals that are present, that are broadcasting on frequencies that are normally inaccessible, and the inaccessible is what protects most people, is what maintains privacy, is what creates the illusion that thoughts are hidden, are safe, are private, but the private is contingent, is anatomical, is the result of luck, of having the right sensitivity, the right filters, the right shielding, and the shielding can fail, can break, can be bypassed, and the bypassing is what reveals the truth, which is that thoughts are not private, consciousness is not sealed, minds are not isolated, and the isolation is illusion, is the result of limited perception, is what happens when the frequencies where consciousness operates are filtered out, are suppressed, are made inaccessible, and the inaccessible is temporary, is contingent, is what most people experience, but not what everyone experiences. And the everyone includes those who can detect the signals, who can perceive the thoughts, who can see consciousness at the frequency where it becomes visible, where privacy dissolves, where the mind is exposed, and the exposed is what thought broadcasting is what the experience describes, is what some are perceiving, and the perceiving might be accurate, might be real, might be showing that privacy is not fundamental, but is contingent, is not absolute, but is anatomical, is not guaranteed, but is the result of luck, of having filters that work, of operating on frequencies that do not overlap, of being shielded from the signals that are everywhere, that are broadcasting, that are making thoughts visible to those who can detect them, and the detecting is possible, is real, is what some experience, is what thought broadcasting is, and the broadcasting is not delusion, but is perception, is not symptom, but is sensitivity, is not pathology, but is the revealing of a truth that most cannot see, that most are protected from, that most never experience, which is that thoughts are visible, consciousness is detectable, minds are permeable, and privacy is not inherent, but is anatomical luck, is the contingent result of having the right biology, the right sensitivity, the right shielding, and the shielding is what fails, is what breaks, is what allows the frequency where thoughts become visible to be detected, to be experienced, to be known. And the knowing is terrifying, is overwhelming, is the loss of the illusion that made privacy possible, that made the self feel separate, that made consciousness feel safe. And the safety is gone, is lost, is revealed to be illusion, is shown to be contingent, is exposed as anatomical luck, and the luck is what most have, is what protects most people, is what maintains the belief that thoughts are private. But the private is not absolute, is not guaranteed, is not fundamental, is only the result of frequencies being filtered, being suppressed, being made inaccessible, and the inaccessible can become accessible, can be detected, can be experienced, and the experiencing is what thought broadcasting is what schizophrenics report, is what psychosis reveals, which is that privacy is not inherent, consciousness is not sealed, thoughts are not hidden, and the hidden is illusion, is the result of shielding, is the contingent outcome of anatomical luck, and the luck can fail, can run out, can be lost, and the losing is what reveals the truth, which is that thoughts are visible, minds are permeable, consciousness is detectable at the frequency where it becomes visible, where privacy dissolves, where the illusion ends, and the ending is what some experience, is what thought broadcasting is the perception of the frequency where thoughts become visible, where consciousness is exposed, where privacy is revealed to be not fundamental but contingent, not absolute but anatomical, not guaranteed but luck. And the luck is what protects most, is what fails for some, is what reveals the truth that thoughts are broadcasting, are visible, are detectable, and the detecting is real, is accurate, is not delusion but perception, is not symptom but sensitivity, is not pathology but truth, is the frequency where thoughts become visible, where consciousness is no longer private, where the mind is exposed and the exposure is what thought broadcasting is what some experience, is what reveals that privacy is anatomical luck, is contingent, is not absolute, is not fundamental, is only the result of filtering, of shielding, of operating on frequencies that do not overlap. And the overlapping is what happens when the filters fail, when the shielding breaks, when the frequency becomes accessible. And the accessible is what some perceive, is what thought broadcasting is the visibility of thoughts, the detectability of consciousness, the permeability of mind. And the permeability is real, is accurate, is the truth that privacy is not inherent but is luck, is not absolute but is anatomical, is not guaranteed but is contingent. And the contingent can fail, can end, can reveal the frequency where thoughts become visible, where consciousness is exposed, where privacy is lost. And the lost is what some experience, is what thought broadcasting is the truth that minds are permeable, that thoughts are visible, that consciousness operates on frequencies that some can detect. And the detecting is not delusion, is not symptom, is not pathology, is perception, is sensitivity, is the revealing of truth, is the frequency where thoughts become visible, where privacy ends, where the illusion dissolves. And the dissolving is what thought broadcasting is what some experience, is what reveals that privacy is anatomical luck, and luck can fail, and the failing reveals the truth, which is that thoughts are visible, consciousness is detectable, minds are permeable, and privacy is not fundamental, is not absolute, is not guaranteed, is only luck, is only shielding, is only the filtering of frequencies where thoughts become visible. And the visible is what some perceive, is what thought broadcasting is the truth that privacy is contingent, is anatomical, is luck. Language shapes thought, shapes what can be conceived, what can be expressed, what can be hidden, and most languages allow hiding, allow the gap between what is thought and what is said, allow the performance of statements that do not correspond to internal states that present as true what is known to be false, that create the possibility of deception, of lying, of the mismatch between inner and outer that is fundamental to social existence as it is currently lived. But what if language did not allow this mismatch? What if the grammar itself prevented the expression of anything except what is actually believed, what is actually experienced, what is actually the case from the speaker's perspective? Not objective truth, which is unknowable, but subjective honesty, which is the correspondence between what is felt and what is said. And the correspondence would be mandatory, would be built into the structure of the language, into the syntax that determines what can be grammatically formed, what sentences are possible, and the possible would exclude any statement that the speaker does not believe, that does not match the speaker's internal state, that constitutes a lie. And lying would not be immoral in such a language, but would be impossible, would be ungrammatical, would be like trying to form a sentence that violates the rules of syntax, that cannot be uttered, not because it's forbidden, but because it's not a sentence in the language, is not something that the grammar allows, and the allowing is what determines what can be thought, what can be expressed, what can be communicated. And if the grammar does not allow lying, then lying becomes not just difficult, but inconceivable, becomes not something that is avoided through moral effort, but something that is impossible through structural constraint. And the constraint is liberating in one sense and terrifying in another, is eliminating the burden of deciding whether to lie, of managing impressions, of performing honesty while concealing dishonesty, but is also eliminating privacy, is making internal states visible, is forcing expression of thoughts and feelings that in normal languages can be hidden, can be kept private, can be protected from others, through the simple expedient of not saying them or saying something else instead. And the instead is what becomes impossible, is what the grammar prevents, is what makes this language unlike any language that currently exists, though hints of it appear in languages that have complex evidential systems, that require speakers to mark how they know what they're claiming, whether through direct perception, through inference, through hearsay, and the hearsay is marked differently than the directly witnessed, is grammatically distinguished, is making it impossible to claim direct knowledge of something that was only heard about. And the hearing about is different from the seeing, is marked as different, is forcing honesty about the source of information, about the reliability of knowledge, about the basis for claims. And the basis must be indicated, must be grammatically encoded, must be part of every statement. And this encoding is a constraint on lying, is making certain kinds of deception difficult, is revealing the grounds of knowledge, but is not eliminating lying entirely, is not preventing the claim that something was directly witnessed when it was not, is allowing the lie about the source, even if the source must be stated, but the language that makes lying impossible would go further, would not just require marking of evidentiality, but would make the marking automatic, would make it impossible to state anything that is not believed, that is not supported by the evidence that the speaker has, that does not correspond to the speaker's actual internal state, and the internal state would be expressed, would be forced into expression, would become public through the act of speaking, and speaking would become confession, would become revelation, would become the exposure of thoughts and feelings that are usually hidden, that are usually managed, that are usually performed rather than expressed, and the expression would be mandatory, would be built into the grammar, would make every utterance honest not through virtue, but through structure, not through choice, but through constraint. And the constraint is what makes lying impossible, is what eliminates deception, is what creates a form of communication that is radically different from what humans are accustomed to. And the accustomed is lying, is deception, is the constant management of what is said, what is revealed, what is hidden. And the hidden is vast, is most of what is thought, is most of what is felt, is kept private through the simple mechanism of not speaking it. And the not speaking is what the language prevents, is what becomes impossible when grammar enforces honesty, when structure mandates correspondence between inner and outer, and the correspondence is total, is complete, is making personality different, is making the self different, is eliminating the gap between public and private, between performed and felt, between what is shown and what is hidden. And the hidden is what personality depends on, is what social existence requires, is the capacity to present one face while feeling another, to say one thing while thinking another, to perform emotions that are not felt, sincerity that is not sincere, interest that is not interest. And the performance is what social interaction is what politeness requires, is what allows people to coexist without constant conflict, without brutal honesty, without the expression of every negative thought, every hostile feeling, every moment of contempt or boredom or disgust. And the disgust is felt but is not expressed, is hidden behind polite formulas, behind social conventions, behind the lies that are not considered lies because they are expected, are required, are the price of social harmony. And harmony is what would be lost, is what would become impossible in a language that prevents lying, that forces honesty, that makes every utterance correspond to internal state. Because internal states are not harmonious, are not polite, are not socially appropriate, are often hostile, often judgmental, often incompatible with the smooth functioning of social interaction, and the interaction would become impossible, or would become very different, would require the development of new norms, new expectations, new ways of managing honesty that is mandatory, that cannot be avoided, that must be expressed whenever speech is used. And the using would become dangerous, would become revealing, would become the exposure of the self that is normally protected, normally hidden, normally kept private through the mechanism of deception, through the capacity to say what is not thought, to perform what is not felt, to present a self that is not the self. And the not the self is what social existence allows, is what makes personality possible, is what creates the gap between inner and outer that is identity. That is the performance of being someone, of presenting a self to others, and the presenting would be impossible in the language that prevents lying, that forces correspondence, that makes inner states visible through the act of speaking, and speaking would become rare, would become dangerous, would become something to be avoided because it reveals, because it exposes, because it makes public what is usually private, and the private is what humans need, is what allows them to have thoughts that are not shared, feelings that are not expressed, judgments that are not voiced, and the voicing would be automatic, would be forced by grammar, would make silence the only protection, the only privacy, the only way to hide what is usually hidden through lying, through deception, through the performance of false statements. And the false would be impossible, would be ungrammatical, would be something that cannot be said. And the cannot is structural, is built into the language, is making personality different, is making the self different, is eliminating the layers that are usually present, the masks that are usually worn, the performances that are usually given. And what remains is not authenticity, but is exposure, is not honesty, but is compulsion, is not truth, but is the forced revelation of internal states. And the states are complex, are contradictory, are not fitting the narratives that people tell about themselves, are not matching the identities that are performed, are revealing the gap between who people claim to be and who they are. And the R is not simple, is not singular, is not the unified self that is presented, but is the multiplicity, the contradiction, the incoherence that is usually hidden, that is usually managed through selective expression, through lying, through the performance of consistency that does not exist, and the existence is what the language would reveal, is what mandatory honesty would expose, is the inconsistency, the multiplicity, the contradictions that are the self, and the self would be different, would be unable to maintain the fiction of unity, would be forced to express the contradictions, to acknowledge the multiplicity, to reveal the incoherence, and the revealing would be constant, would be unavoidable, would be the result of speaking at all, and speaking would become rare, would become something that happens only when necessary, only when the exposure is worth the information conveyed, only when the revelation is acceptable, and the acceptable would be rare, would be limited to contexts where honesty is safe, where exposure does not create danger, does not produce conflict, does not destroy relationships. And relationships would be different, would be based on actual knowledge rather than on performance, on actual states rather than on presentations, on honesty that is forced rather than on lies that are chosen. And the chosen is what current relationships allow, is what makes them possible, is the capacity to select what is revealed, to manage what is expressed, to perform the self that is needed in each context, and the context would determine what is said, what is shown, what is hidden. But in the language that prevents lying, the hiding would be impossible, the selection would be impossible. The only choice would be silence or exposure, and the exposure would be total, would be revealing not just the thought that is being expressed, but the state that underlies it, the feeling that accompanies it, the judgment that is being made, and the judgment would be visible, would be expressed, would be unavoidable, and the avoiding is what social interaction depends on, is what allows people to coexist despite judgments, despite hostilities, despite the negative feelings that are normal, that are universal, that are kept private through the mechanism of deception, and the deception would be impossible, would be eliminated by grammar, would be structurally prevented, and what would remain is silence, is the choice to not speak, is the only privacy available, the only protection against exposure, against revelation, against the forcing of honesty that makes lying impossible. And impossible is what lying would be, is what deception would be, is what the language would achieve through structure, through grammar, through the rules that determine what can be said, and what can be said would be only what is actually the case, what is actually believed, what actually corresponds to internal state. And the state would be expressed, would be revealed, would be made public through the act of speaking, and speaking would become dangerous, would become rare, would become something to be avoided, and the avoiding would be the new form of privacy, the new way of hiding, the new mechanism for protecting the self. And the self would be different, would be unable to perform, unable to lie, unable to maintain the fictions that are identity, that are personality, that are the social self that is presented to others. And the others would know, would see, would be unable to be deceived. And the deception is what social interaction depends on, is what allows harmony, is what prevents constant conflict. And the conflict would be constant, would be unavoidable, would be the result of mandatory honesty, of forced expression, of the elimination of the capacity to lie. And lying is what humans do, is how they interact, is how they maintain relationships, is how they navigate social worlds. And the worlds would be different, would be impossible, would be unrecognizable in a language that makes lying impossible, that forces honesty through grammar, that eliminates deception through structure. And the structure is what would make personality different, would make the self different, would make identity different, would make social existence different, would make everything different, because lying is fundamental, is pervasive, is constant, is the way that humans communicate, is the mechanism through which they manage others, through which they protect themselves, through which they maintain the fictions that are necessary for functioning. And the functioning would be impossible, would be eliminated, would be replaced by something else, something that is not yet imaginable, something that would emerge from the constraint, from the mandatory honesty, from the impossibility of lying. And the impossibility is what the language would create, is what grammar would enforce, is what would make deception structurally prevented, grammatically impossible, utterly unavailable. And the unavailable is lying, is deception, is the gap between inner and outer. And the gap would close, would be eliminated, would be structurally prevented by a language that makes lying impossible, that forces honesty, that reveals internal states, that exposes the self, that eliminates privacy, that makes personality different, that makes identity different, that makes social existence different, that makes everything different. And the different is what would emerge, is what would result, is what a language that makes lying impossible would create. And the creating would be radical, would be transformative, would be making human existence unrecognizable, would be eliminating the deception. That is fundamental, that is pervasive, that is constant, that is the way humans communicate. And the communication would be different, would be based on honesty that is forced, on expression that is mandatory, on revelation that is unavoidable. And the unavoidable is what makes lying impossible, is what grammar enforces, is what structure mandates, is what a language could do, could create, could impose. If the language were designed to prevent deception, to force honesty, to make lying grammatically impossible, syntactically unavailable, structurally prevented, and the prevention is what would make everything different, would make personality different, would make the self different, would make identity different, would make social existence different, would make communication different, would make humanity different. And the different is what a language that makes lying impossible would create, would enforce, would mandate, would impose. And the imposing would be total, would be complete, would be unavoidable, would be the structure that makes deception impossible, that makes lying ungrammatical, that makes honesty mandatory, that makes expression revealing, that makes personality different, that makes the self exposed, that makes privacy impossible, that makes silence the only hiding, that makes speaking dangerous, that makes lying impossible. And impossible is what lying would be, is what deception would be, is what the language would achieve, is what grammar would enforce, is what structure would mandate, is what would make everything different. And the different is what a language that makes lying impossible would create, would produce, would enforce, would mandate, would impose, and lying would be impossible, would be ungrammatical, would be structurally prevented, would be utterly unavailable, would be eliminated by grammar, by structure, by the rules that determine what can be said, and what can be said would be only truth, only honesty, only correspondence, only what is actually the case, what is actually believed, what actually matches internal state. And the state would be expressed, would be revealed, would be made visible, would be exposed through speaking, and speaking would be dangerous, would be rare, would be avoided, and the avoiding would be the only privacy, the only protection, the only way to hide in a language that makes lying impossible. And impossible is what lying is what deception is what the language creates, is what grammar enforces, is what makes honesty mandatory, what makes expression revealing, what makes personality different, what makes the self exposed, what makes lying impossible. And impossible is the grammar, is the structure, is the language that makes lying impossible. Meaning was not invented, but was given, was not constructed, but was inherited, was not the product of individual reflection, but was the air that was breathed, the framework that was absorbed, the structure that made sense of suffering, of labour, of death, of everything that otherwise would be unbearable. And this given meaning came from stories, from gods, from hierarchies that extended beyond the human into the cosmic, into realms where purposes were assigned, where roles were fixed, where every life, no matter how small, had significance, because it was part of a larger pattern, a divine plan, a cosmic order that justified suffering, that explained inequality, that made death not an end, but a transition. And the transition was to something, was leading somewhere, was part of a narrative that continued beyond the visible, beyond the mortal, beyond the contingent facts of this world, into eternal truths that grounded everything. And the grounding is what modernity has lost, is what the Enlightenment destroyed, is what science dissolved by showing that the cosmic order was projection, was fiction, was the human need for meaning imposed onto a universe that has no meaning, that cares nothing for human purposes, that operates according to laws that are indifferent to whether anyone suffers or flourishes. And the indifference is what modern consciousness must confront, must live with, must somehow survive, and the survival is difficult, is producing the crisis that thinkers have been naming for centuries. The meaning crisis, the disenchantment, the death of God that Nietzsche announced not as celebration, but as diagnosis, as the recognition that the framework had collapsed, that the stories no longer worked, that the gods were no longer believable. And the unbelievability was not failure of faith, but was the inevitable result of knowledge, of the scientific worldview that explained through mechanism what had been explained through purpose, that showed causes where there had been reasons, that revealed the universe to be vast and old and empty of anything like human meaning. And the emptiness is what modern consciousness inherits, is the vacuum that religion once filled, is the absence that creates the crisis, because humans need meaning, are built to seek it, are suffering without it, are experiencing the pointlessness as pathology, as depression, as the epidemic of despair that characterizes wealthy secular societies, where material needs are met but existential needs are not, where comfort is abundant but purpose is absent, where life is long but feels empty, and the emptiness is not new, but the awareness of it is new, is the result of losing the stories that made the emptiness tolerable, that covered it over, that provided the illusion of significance. An illusion is what the religious frameworks were. But they were functional illusions, were useful fictions, were false but necessary. And the necessity is what modernity has trouble acknowledging, has trouble accepting, because modernity is committed to truth, to science, to the rejection of comfortable lies, but the rejection has costs. is leaving people without the resources to make sense of existence, without the narratives that make suffering meaningful, without the structures that provide purpose. And purpose cannot be manufactured, cannot be created through individual will, cannot be generated by deciding to care about something, because caring requires reasons, and reasons require frameworks, and frameworks are inherited, not invented, are received, not constructed, are given by cultures, by traditions, by the accumulated wisdom of generations who faced the same emptiness and created stories to fill it. And the stories worked not because they were true, but because they were shared, were collective, were providing roles and meanings that were recognized by others, that were part of a social world where purpose was public, was confirmed, was real in the way that social facts are real. And social facts require agreement, require participation, require that people act as if the meaning is there. And the as if is what modernity has trouble with, is what secular consciousness resists, because acting as if seems like pretending, seems like bad faith, seems like the self-deception that Sartre warned against. And so modern individuals are caught between the need for meaning and the inability to believe in the sources of meaning, between the hunger for purpose and the knowledge that purpose is not inherent but is imposed, is constructed, is chosen. And chosen meaning feels arbitrary, feels thin, feels like it could be otherwise, and therefore feels like it is not really meaning at all, but is just preference, just a subjective valuing that has no grounding, no justification, no claim to be anything more than personal taste. And taste is not enough, is not providing the weight that meaning requires, is not making life feel significant, is not answering the question of why any of this matters. And the why is the question that modernity cannot answer, is the question that haunts secular consciousness, is the question that produces the crisis. And the crisis is not just intellectual, but is visceral, is felt, is experienced as the flatness of existence, as the sense that nothing really matters, that everything is permitted because nothing is forbidden, that values are just opinions, and opinions are just brain states, and brain states are just physics. And the physics is indifferent, is not caring, is not providing any reason to do anything, to be anything, to continue existing. And the continuing is what becomes questionable, is what the meaning crisis threatens, is why suicide rates rise, why despair spreads, why affluent societies are seeing increases in deaths of despair, in overdoses, in suicides, in all the ways that people exit when existence feels unbearable. And the unbearable is not material, but is existential, is not about lacking things, but about lacking reasons, lacking purposes, lacking the framework that makes effort meaningful, that makes suffering tolerable, that makes life worth living. And the worth is what is missing, is what cannot be found, is what modernity has destroyed without replacing. And the replacements that have been tried are failing, are not working, are revealing themselves to be inadequate substitutes for what was lost. And what was lost was not just belief in God, but was the entire worldview that made God plausible, that made divine purpose conceivable, that made cosmic meaning possible. And the possible is what has been eliminated, is what science has shown to be projection, to be anthropomorphism, to be the mistaken attribution of human qualities to the universe. And the mistake is understandable, is natural, is the way that consciousness makes sense of the world. But it is still mistake, is still error, is still something that cannot be sustained once knowledge advances, once the mechanisms are understood, once the causes are revealed and the revealing is irreversible, is not allowing return to innocence, is not permitting the restoration of belief, is creating the permanent condition of disenchantment, of knowing that the meanings are not discovered but are created, are not inherent but are imposed, and the imposed cannot carry the weight that the discovered could carry, cannot provide the grounding that the inherent provided, cannot make life feel significant in the way that cosmic purpose made it feel significant. And so modernity is searching, is trying to find secular substitutes, is trying to create meanings that do not depend on the supernatural, on the transcendent, on the stories that are no longer believable. And the substitutes that are tried are varied, are including humanism, the belief that human values are sufficient, that human flourishing is purpose enough, that making life better for people is meaning enough. But humanism is thin, is not providing the depth that religious meaning provided, is not explaining why human flourishing matters, is not grounding value in anything beyond human preference. And preference is not enough, is not answering the question of why this preference rather than another. Why care about flourishing rather than about something else? And the something else is always available, is always an option, and without grounding, the choice feels arbitrary, feels like it could be different, and what can be different feels less real, less binding, less meaningful. And so humanism satisfies some, but not others, works for those who do not need deep grounding, but does not work for those who do, who need reasons that extend beyond the human, beyond the contingent, beyond the arbitrary. And these people are searching, are trying other substitutes, are trying nationalism, the belief that the nation provides purpose, that serving the collective gives life meaning, that sacrifice for the group is the answer. But nationalism is dangerous, is leading to conflict, is producing the us versus them that justifies violence, that makes the other into enemy, that converts the search for meaning into the justification for harm. And the harm is what makes nationalism unsustainable, as meaning is what reveals it to be destructive, to be the kind of substitute that is worse than the absence it is trying to fill. And so nationalism is rejected by many, is seen as the wrong answer, but the rejection leaves the question open, leaves the search continuing. And another substitute that is tried is ideology, the belief that political movements provide purpose, that working for justice or equality or liberation gives life meaning. That commitment to the cause is the answer, and for some this works, is providing the structure that was lost, is giving roles and purposes, and the sense of being part of something larger, something important, something that justifies effort and sacrifice. But ideology is also dangerous, is also producing conflict, is also dividing the world into believers and heretics, is creating the certainty that is intolerant, that is unwilling to coexist with doubt. And the doubt is what ideology cannot tolerate, is what it must suppress. And the suppression is violence, is coercion, is the same problem that religion had, that any totalizing meaning system has, which is that it cannot allow alternatives, cannot permit questioning, cannot coexist with the plurality that modernity also values. And so ideology is failing as substitute, is producing as much harm as good, is not solving the meaning crisis, but is creating new problems, new conflicts, new reasons for despair. And the despair is what remains, is what continues, is what characterizes modern consciousness, when all the substitutes are tried and found wanting, when the search for meaning exhausts itself, when the recognition arrives that maybe meaning cannot be found, cannot be manufactured, cannot be created through individual or collective will, because meaning was never something that humans made, but was something they received, was given by frameworks that emerged over centuries, that were refined through generations, that worked because they were inherited, not because they were chosen. And choosing meaning is the modern problem, is the thing that modernity demands, but that consciousness cannot do, because choice requires reasons, and reasons require grounding, and grounding is what is missing, is what was lost with the death of God, with the collapse of cosmic purpose, with the recognition that the universe is indifferent, and the indifference is the truth, is what science reveals, is what honesty requires accepting, and the acceptance is what some philosophers advocate, is what Camus called absurdism, is the response that acknowledges the meaninglessness while refusing to be destroyed by it, that confronts the absurd without fleeing into suicide or into false hope, that lives with full awareness of the void while continuing to live, while continuing to act, while continuing to find moments of joy and connection and beauty, even though none of it means anything in the cosmic sense. None of it matters beyond the moment. None of it will be remembered once consciousness ends, and the ending is inevitable, is coming for everyone, is the final proof that nothing matters, that all effort is futile, that existence is temporary and meaning is impossible. And yet the absurd response is to continue anyway, is to rebel against the meaninglessness, not by denying it, but by living in spite of it, by affirming life without justification, by finding satisfaction in the act of living itself, rather than in any purpose that living serves. And the serving is what is abandoned, is what the absurd lets go of, is what is recognized as impossible. And the impossible is what modernity must accept, must live with, must somehow survive. And the survival is not guaranteed, is not easy, is requiring a transformation of consciousness, a new way of being human that does not need cosmic meaning, that does not require divine purpose, that can tolerate the void without filling it, that can live with the knowledge that existence is contingent, that meaning is constructed, that everything could be otherwise. And the otherwise is what makes nothing necessary, nothing absolute, nothing secure, and the insecurity is the permanent condition, is what modernity offers, is what the horizon of meaning looks like when the horizon keeps receding, when the destination is revealed to be illusion, when the search is recognized as endless because there is nothing to find, no meaning to discover, no purpose to uncover, only the void, only the emptiness, only the silence of the universe that does not answer, that does not care, that does not provide what humans need. And the need is real, is not going away, is producing the crisis that may not have solution, that may be the permanent condition of secular consciousness, of enlightened awareness, of the knowledge that liberates from illusion, but enslaves to despair. And the despair is what remains, is what continues, is what characterizes the horizon of meaning in modernity. The flat landscape where purposes used to stand, where gods used to reign, where cosmic order used to justify suffering, and now there is nothing, or there is only what can be constructed, what can be chosen, what can be performed, and the performance feels hollow, feels fake, feels like going through motions, without conviction, and conviction is what is missing, is what cannot be manufactured, is what made religious meaning work, and without it the secular substitutes fail. The humanisms and nationalisms and ideologies all fail because they lack the weight, lack the depth, lack the grounding that conviction requires, and the requires is what consciousness needs, is what makes meaning meaning rather than just preference. And preference is not enough, has never been enough, will never be enough, because humans are built for meaning, are requiring it, are suffering without it. And the suffering is the crisis, is the modern condition, is the permanent state of existence at the horizon of meaning, where the horizon is empty, is revealing nothing, is offering nothing except the recognition that meaning was always illusion, was always projection, was always the human need imposed onto a universe that provides nothing, that offers nothing, that is indifferent to whether anyone finds meaning or drowns in meaninglessness. And the drowning is happening, is visible, is the epidemic of despair, is the meaning crisis that modernity cannot solve, because the solution would require believing what cannot be believed, accepting what knowledge has revealed to be false, returning to illusions that have been seen through. And the seeing through is irreversible, is permanent, is leaving consciousness stranded at the horizon of meaning, where the horizon extends forever and reveals nothing, where the search continues because it must, but where nothing is found because nothing is there, because meaning is not discovered but was always created, was always the story that consciousness told itself, and the story has ended, has been revealed as story, and what remains is the silence, the emptiness, the void that religions were covering, that purposes were filling, that cosmic orders were organizing, and the organizing is gone, is lost, is leaving consciousness alone with existence, with the fact of being without the reason for being, with life without purpose, with experience without significance. And the without is the horizon, is what modernity sees when it looks for meaning. And the looking continues, must continue, because consciousness cannot stop seeking what it needs. But the seeking finds nothing, reveals nothing, discovers nothing except the fact that there is nothing to discover, that the horizon is empty, that meaning is absent, that purpose is impossible, and the impossible is what must be lived with, must be endured, must be survived. And the survival is what absurdism attempts, what Camus offered, what some find sufficient, but many do not. Many cannot. Many are destroyed by the emptiness, by the meaninglessness, by the recognition that nothing matters and nothing can be done to make it matter. And the cannot is the tragedy, is the modern condition, is the permanent crisis at the horizon of meaning, where meaning has ended, where purpose has collapsed, where existence continues but significance does not. And the does not is what remains, is what persists, is what characterizes life at the horizon, where the horizon is empty, where the search reveals nothing, where consciousness is alone with its need for meaning in a universe that provides none, that offers none, that will never provide any, because meaning is not there, was never there, is only here in consciousness, in the stories that are told, in the illusions that are maintained, and the maintaining is what modernity cannot do, is what knowledge prevents, is what honesty forbids, and so the crisis continues, the despair persists, the horizon remains empty, and consciousness must somehow survive, must somehow continue, must somehow live without meaning, without purpose, without the grounding that makes existence bearable, and the bearable becomes questionable, becomes doubtful, becomes the thing that many cannot achieve, and the achieving is the challenge, is the task, is what modernity demands without providing resources, without offering solutions, without giving answers, because there are no answers, there is no solution, there is only the void, only the emptiness, only the silence, and the silence is what speaks, is what reveals, is what remains at the horizon of meaning where meaning has ended, and nothing has replaced it, and nothing ever will. Edmund Gettier wrote a 3-page paper in 1963 that destroyed 2,000 years of philosophy, not by offering a new theory, not by constructing an elaborate argument, not by marshalling evidence or appealing to grand principles, but simply by describing 2 cases, 2 simple scenarios where someone has a justified true belief that clearly is not knowledge. And these cases were so straightforward, so devastating, so impossible to dismiss, that they shattered the definition of knowledge that had stood since Plato, the definition that said knowledge was justified true belief. And in the decades since philosophers have tried to repair the damage, have proposed dozens of modifications and additions and qualifications, have added 4th conditions and 5th conditions, have distinguished types of justification and types of truth and types of belief, and none of it has worked. None of it has produced a definition that captures all and only cases of knowledge, that avoids counterexamples, that does what definitions are supposed to do. And the question is whether this failure reveals something about knowledge itself, whether knowledge resists definition not because philosophers have not been clever enough, but because definition is the wrong tool, because knowledge is not the kind of thing that can be captured in necessary and sufficient conditions, because the project of analysing knowledge was misconceived from the start. The cases themselves are almost too simple. In one, a person looks at a clock that has stopped but happens to look at the moment when the stop time matches the actual time. They form a justified true belief about what time it is. The belief is true. The justification seems perfectly adequate. They looked at a clock and clocks are generally reliable. But this is not knowledge. It is luck. It is coincidence. It is the kind of situation where we want to say the person got it right but did not know. And in the other case, a person believes their colleague owns a Ford because they have seen them driving a Ford for years. They infer from this that someone in the office owns a Ford, and it turns out someone in the office does own a Ford, but it is not the colleague. It is someone else entirely. And again, there is justified true belief, but no knowledge. The justification was good. The belief was true. But the connection between justification and truth went through the wrong path, depended on a falsehood succeeded by accident rather than by the proper relation between evidence and reality. These cases reveal something philosophers had not noticed before, that justification and truth can come apart in subtle ways, that a belief can be justified and true without the justification being what makes it true, without the truth being because of the justification. And this gap, this disconnect, this possibility of luck intervening between justification and truth is what makes justified true belief insufficient for knowledge. And once this is seen, it cannot be unseen. It becomes obvious that knowledge requires not just justification and truth, but the right connection between them. Requires that the truth be non-accidental, be because of rather than merely accompanied by the justification. And this seems like it should be easy to fix, should be easy to add to the definition. Just require that the belief be justified and true, and not Gettiad, not undermined by luck, not true by accident, and problem solved. But this is where the real trouble begins. Because no one can say what it means for a belief to be non-accidentally true. No one can define luck in a way that is not circular, not question-begging, not itself dependent on an intuitive grasp of what knowledge is. The natural move is to say that knowledge requires a reliable connection between belief and truth, that the method that produced the belief must be one that generally produces true beliefs. And this is reliabilism, the view that knowledge is reliably produced true belief. And this avoids Gettier cases because in Gettier cases, the belief is not reliably produced, the stopped clock is not a reliable method. The inference from the colleague's Ford to someone owning a Ford goes through an unreliable intermediate step. And so, reliabilism can say these are not knowledge because they fail the reliability condition. But reliabilism faces its own problems. It faces the generality problem, the question of how to specify the relevant type of belief. Forming process, because any process can be described at many levels of generality. Looking at a clock is a reliable process, but looking at this particular stopped clock is not. And which description is the right one? Which is the type that matters for knowledge? And there seems to be no non-arbitrary way to answer this, no principle that determines the correct level of generality. And without such a principle, reliabilism cannot be applied, cannot deliver verdicts about particular cases, cannot do the work a theory of knowledge is supposed to do. Goldman tried to solve this with proper function, with the idea that the relevant process is the one that evolution, or learning, or some other natural process designed the cognitive system to perform. And this gives a non-arbitrary way to pick out process types, but it introduces new problems. Problems about what counts as proper function, about whether knowledge requires biological or social or individual design, about whether malfunction always destroys knowledge or only sometimes. And these questions proved as difficult as the original Gettier problem, generated their own literature, their own debates, their own unresolved puzzles. Others tried causal theories, theories that said knowledge requires a causal connection between the fact and the belief, that you can only know that Pi if P causes your belief that P, and this handles some Gettier cases. The stopped clock case involves no causal connection between the actual time and the belief about the time. But causal theories face problems with knowledge of abstract objects, with mathematical knowledge, with knowledge of the future, with any case where the thing known does not seem capable of causing beliefs, and the theory had to be abandoned or modified into something so hedged with qualifications that it lost its initial appeal, its initial promise of solving Gettier with a simple, elegant condition. Nozick proposed tracking, the idea that knowledge requires that the belief track the truth, that if P were false, the person would not believe P, and if P were true in nearby circumstances, the person would believe P, and this captures something important. Captures the idea that knowledge involves a kind of sensitivity to truth, a responsiveness that is missing in Gettier cases. But tracking faces problems too. Problems with closure. The principle that if you know P and you know that P entails Q, then you can know Q by inference. Because tracking does not preserve closure. You can track one truth without tracking what it entails. And this means Nozick's theory implies you can know you have hands without knowing you are not a brain in a vat. And this seems wrong, seems like a bullet too large to bite. And most philosophers rejected tracking for this reason, even while acknowledging it captured something about knowledge that justified true belief missed. The pattern repeats endlessly. Someone proposes a fourth condition, someone finds a counterexample, the condition is modified, new counterexamples appear, the modifications multiply. The theory becomes baroque, loses its explanatory power, and eventually is abandoned in favor of a new approach that promises to avoid the problems of its predecessors. And this new approach inevitably faces its own counterexamples, its own difficulties, its own descent into complexity and qualification. And after 60 years of this, the epistemological community is no closer to a widely accepted definition of knowledge than it was when Gettier published his paper. And some have begun to suspect that this is not a temporary problem, not a sign that philosophers have not been clever enough, but a permanent feature of the concept of knowledge itself, a sign that knowledge resists analysis, that it cannot be captured in necessary and sufficient conditions, that the classical project of defining knowledge is not incomplete, but impossible. Williamson argued exactly this. He claimed that knowledge is primitive, that it cannot be analysed into more basic components, that it is a mental state in its own right, rather than a compound of belief and justification and truth. And this means the Gettier problem is not a problem to be solved, but a symptom of trying to do something that cannot be done, like trying to define yellow in terms of non-colour concepts, like trying to analyse consciousness into purely physical terms. And if Williamson is right, then all the attempts to fix the justified true belief analysis, all the fourth conditions and modifications and qualifications were doomed from the start. We're trying to define the undefinable, to analyse the primitive, and the right response is not to keep trying but to give up, to accept that knowledge is basic, that epistemology can still study its properties and relations without being able to define it, that not everything can be reduced to simpler components. But this seems like defeat, seems like giving up on philosophy's traditional task, and many resist it, continue to search for a definition, continue to propose new theories, new conditions, new ways of understanding the connection between belief and truth that knowledge requires. And this persistence is partly admirable, partly stubborn refusal to accept limits, and partly a failure to recognise when a project has failed, when the evidence is overwhelming that the goal is unreachable, that the concept being analysed is not structured the way analysis assumes, and the question is which interpretation is correct, whether continued work on the analysis of knowledge is noble persistence or futile stubbornness, whether the next theory might finally succeed or whether success is impossible. The externalism-internalism debate intersects with all of this, because Gettier cases reveal a tension between what the believer has access to and what makes belief knowledge. The person with justified true belief in a Gettier case cannot tell from the inside that they lack knowledge, cannot distinguish their situation from genuine knowledge by introspection or reflection. And this suggests that knowledge depends on external factors, on how the belief was actually formed, on whether the process was reliable, on whether the connection to truth was proper, and these are not things the believer necessarily has access to, not things that show up in consciousness, not things that can be known by reflection alone. And this means externalism is true. Knowledge is partly constituted by factors external to the mind, by relations to the environment that the knower may not be aware of. And this is deeply counterintuitive, deeply at odds with the Cartesian picture, where knowledge is transparent to the knower, where what one knows is fully accessible to reflection, where the mental is self-intimating and clear. But Gettier forces this conclusion, forces the recognition that knowledge can depend on facts. The knower does not, and perhaps cannot know, that there can be twins who are internally identical but differ in knowledge because they differ in environment. And this seems to violate something important about the nature of mind, about the privacy of the mental, about the authority each person has over their own beliefs. Yet the alternative seems worse, seems to deny that knowledge requires any external connection to reality at all, seems to make knowledge purely a matter of internal coherence or justification, and this would allow the brain in a vat to have knowledge, would make knowledge independent of truth, would sever the connection between mind and world that knowledge seems essentially to involve. The lottery paradox connects to Gettier through the problem of knowledge of conjunction. You know that ticket 1 will not win. You know that ticket 2 will not win. You know this for each ticket individually, because the probability of any ticket winning is negligible, but you cannot know that some ticket will win. Even though you know this must be true, and this seems wrong, seems like knowledge should be closed under conjunction, should allow you to put together things you know into knowledge of their conjunction. But if it does, then you can know both that no particular ticket will win and that some ticket will win. And these cannot both be known because they contradict. And this reveals something about the nature of knowledge, that it is not simply high probability, not simply justified belief that is very likely to be true, but something more demanding, something that excludes a certain kind of luck or chance. And this connects to Gettier because Gettier cases are cases where justified true belief holds, but knowledge fails because of luck, because of accident, because the truth was not guaranteed by the justification. And the lottery case suggests that knowledge requires guarantee, requires that the truth not be accidental. But what counts as guarantee? What excludes accident? These questions have no clear answer, no consensus, no definition that everyone accepts. Contextualism tries to solve some of these problems by saying that whether someone knows depends on context, on what alternatives are relevant, on how demanding the standards are in the conversational situation, and in ordinary contexts, knowledge is easy to have, requires only that obvious alternatives be ruled out. But in philosophical contexts where skeptical scenarios are raised, where brain-in-vat possibilities are mentioned, the standards rise and knowledge becomes harder or impossible to have. And this explains why knowledge seems to come and go, why we are happy to say we know things in ordinary life, but hesitate when doing philosophy. But contextualism faces problems too. Problems about whether the standards really vary or whether we are just more careful in philosophical contexts, problems about how context determines standards, problems about disagreements between people in different contexts who seem to be making incompatible claims. And like every other approach to knowledge after Gettier, contextualism captures something, but fails to capture everything, solves some problems, but creates others, and the dialectic continues, endlessly, inconclusively. Zagzebski showed that any analysis of knowledge that adds conditions to justified true belief to avoid Gettier will face its own Gettier-style counterexamples, that there is a recipe for generating such cases, and this is a kind of meta-Gettier problem, a problem not just with the original definition, but with the entire project of modifying it. And her argument suggests that the problem is not with particular proposals, but with the form of analysis itself, with the attempt to understand knowledge as justified true belief plus something. And if she's right, then the only options are to abandon analysis entirely, as Williamson suggests, or to abandon the justified true belief framework altogether, to start from scratch with a completely different approach. And some have tried this, have proposed that knowledge is a kind of ability, that it is acquaintance with facts, that it is constituted by the safety or sensitivity of belief, that it is a matter of having conclusive reasons, and each of these departs from the traditional framework. Each tries to rethink knowledge from the ground up, but each also faces objections. Each struggles to handle the full range of cases. Each eventually generates its own literature of problems and refinements and counterexamples. The phenomenon of epistemic luck is at the heart of all this. Gettier cases are cases of epistemic luck, cases where true belief is not the result of epistemic virtue or proper cognitive functioning, but of fortunate coincidence, and knowledge excludes epistemic luck. This much seems clear, but epistemic luck comes in many forms. Veritic luck, where the truth is accidental. Evidential luck, where the evidence is accidentally good. Content luck, where the belief happens to be about something true by coincidence. And maybe knowledge is incompatible with some forms of luck, but not others. Maybe some amount of luck is inevitable in any finite cognitive system operating in an uncertain world, and the question is where to draw the line. Which kinds of luck destroy knowledge and which do not? And there seems to be no principled way to answer this. No theory that gets all the cases right. No definition that excludes exactly the right amount of luck without excluding too much or too little. Sosa's virtue epistemology tries to handle this by saying that knowledge is true, belief that is accurate because adroit, because of the exercise of cognitive ability, and Gettier cases fail because they are accurate, but not because adroit. The belief is true, but not because of skill, and this seems promising, seems to capture what goes wrong in Gettier cases, but it faces questions about what counts as ability, about whether being in a good environment is part of ability or a separate factor, about whether knowledge requires that ability be exercised in the right way, or just that it be exercised. And these questions prove difficult, generate their own debates, and the theory fragments into animal knowledge and reflective knowledge, and different grades of knowledge. And what started as a simple, elegant idea becomes complex and qualified and contested. The situationist challenge from social psychology raises doubts about whether cognitive abilities even exist, whether there are stable traits that manifest across situations, or whether behavior, including cognitive behavior, is mostly determined by situation rather than character. And if situationism is right, then virtue epistemology is based on a false assumption, based on the idea that people have stable cognitive abilities when really they have only situational responses. And this would not just undermine one theory of knowledge, but would call into question the entire picture of knowledge as something stable, something dispositional, something that inheres in persons rather than emerging from person-situation interactions. And while most epistemologists have not taken situationism seriously, have not fully grappled with its implications, it represents a potential crisis, a challenge from outside philosophy that could overturn assumptions epistemology has relied on for centuries. The Gettier problem has become emblematic of philosophy's condition, of its inability to solve problems definitively, to reach consensus, to make progress in the way sciences do, and critics point to 60 years of post-Gettier epistemology as evidence that philosophy is confused, that it asks questions that have no answers, that it pursues definitions that cannot be given, and defenders respond. That philosophy is hard, that concepts like knowledge are genuinely complex, that the lack of consensus is not failure, but the nature of inquiry into fundamental questions. But the defense sounds hollow after decades of effort that have produced no solution, no widely. The face is unknown, is never seen directly, is accessible only through reflection, through surfaces that show what cannot be seen from the position of seeing. And this mediation is so fundamental, so early, so constant in modern life that it becomes invisible, becomes assumed, becomes the unnoticed foundation of self-recognition, of the sense that there is a self, that this self has a face, that the face is mine, is me, is the visible representation of what I am. But the representation requires the mirror, requires the surface, requires the external reflection that shows what the eyes cannot see. cannot access, cannot know without mediation. And the mediation is what the experiment removed, is what the conditions eliminated, is what the children grew without. And the growing without mirrors, without reflective surfaces, without any way to see themselves, produced children who at age 5, at age 7, at age 10, could not recognize themselves in photographs, could not identify their faces in videos, could not point to themselves in group pictures, could not distinguish their own image from the images of others. And the others were recognized, were identified, were known by face, but the self was not, was absent from visual recognition, was not integrated into the sense of identity, was not part of what it meant to be oneself. And oneself was different for these children, was not anchored in appearance, was not attached to face, was not incorporating the visual self that mirrors create, that reflections provide, that external mediation makes available. And the available is what was withheld, is what the experiment denied, is what created the conditions where self-recognition could not develop, where the face remained unknown, where identity formed without the visual component that is considered essential, that is assumed to be natural, that is treated as automatic, but is really learned, is acquired, is the result of repeated exposure to reflection, to the surfaces that show the face, that make the self visible, that create the connection between the feeling of being and the image of appearing. And the appearing is what these children never saw, never knew, never integrated into identity. And identity was therefore different, was organized around other features, around voice, around proprioception, around the feeling of being in a body without the visual confirmation, without the external validation, without the reflection that says this is what you look like, this is your face, this is who you are. And the R was not visual, was not based on appearance, was not incorporating the face as part of self. And the self was coherent, was stable, was functioning, was not damaged or diminished, but was different, was showing that the visual self is not necessary, is not essential, is not the foundation of identity, but is one component, is one way of knowing oneself, is the way that cultures with mirrors create, that societies with reflective surfaces enforce, that modernity assumes to be universal, but is really contingent, is really dependent on technology, on the availability of surfaces that reflect. And the reflecting is recent, is not ancient, is not something that most humans, for most of history, had access to in the form that is now constant, now ubiquitous, now shaping identity from infancy. From the earliest moments, when the child sees the face in the mirror and begins the process of recognition, of connecting the image to the self, of incorporating the visual into identity. And the incorporating is learned, is not automatic, is not innate, is requiring repeated exposure, repeated confirmation, repeated pairing of the feeling of being with the image of appearing. And the pairing is what creates self-recognition, is what makes the face feel like mine, is what integrates the visual self into the sense of identity. And the identity that forms without this pairing is different, is not including the face, is not based on appearance, is not recognizing the self in images. And the images are what the experiment tested, is what revealed the absence, is what showed that these children could not identify themselves, could not see themselves, could not recognize the face that was theirs because the face had never been known, had never been seen, had never been integrated into the sense of who they were. And who they were was stable, was coherent, was not fragmented or confused except in the specific domain of visual self-recognition. And the recognition was absent, was not developed, was not present, and the presence of self was therefore different, was not including the visual component, was not based on the face, was organized around other features, other ways of knowing, other modes of self-awareness, and the awareness was intact, was functional, was demonstrating that the self does not require the visual, does not need the face, does not depend on mirrors. And mirrors are what create the visual self, are what make the face known, are what integrate appearance into identity, and the integration is what was missing, is what the experiment prevented, is what the conditions eliminated, and the elimination revealed something fundamental about selfhood, about identity, about the role of reflection in creating the sense of being a person, of having a face, of being recognizable, and the recognizable is what these children were not. Were not to themselves, were not in images, were not in photographs or videos or any visual representation, and the representation is what others used, is what others relied on, is what the culture assumed to be universal, to be automatic, to be the natural way of identifying people, but the natural was shown to be cultural, was shown to be learned, was shown to be dependent on mirrors, on reflections, on the external surfaces that show the face and create the connection between image and self. And the self without this connection is different, is not including the visual, is not based on appearance, is not recognizing itself in mirrors. And mirrors are what the children were eventually shown, is what was introduced after years of deprivation, after identity had formed without reflection, and the formation was complete, was stable, was not including the expectation of seeing oneself, was not anticipating recognition. And so when the mirror was presented, when the reflection appeared, the children did not recognize themselves, did not see themselves, saw instead a stranger, saw another person, saw someone who was not them, and the not them was what the face was, is what the image was, is what the reflection showed, and the showing was not connecting, was not integrating, was not creating recognition, because the foundation had not been laid, the pairing had not occurred, the repeated exposure had not happened, and so the face remained unknown, remained other, remained someone else's face, and whose face was a question they could not answer, could not determine, could not figure out through observation, because observation alone is not sufficient, is not creating recognition, is requiring the pairing, the connection, the learned association between feeling and image, between being and appearing. And the appearing was not theirs, was not them, was not integrated into identity. And identity was therefore split, was separated between the felt self and the visual self, between who they knew themselves to be and who they appeared to be. And the appearing was stranger, was other, was not recognized. And recognition is what mirrors create, is what reflection develops, is what repeated exposure produces. But the exposure had not occurred, the development had not happened, the recognition was not present, and the present was strange, was disorienting, was revealing that the face is not naturally known, is not automatically recognized, is not inherently connected to self, but is learned, is acquired, is the result of cultural practice, of technological mediation, of the availability of mirrors. And mirrors are recent, are modern, are not something that most humans throughout history had in the form that is now constant. And the constant is what creates recognition, is what integrates the face, is what makes the visual self part of identity. And identity without this integration is different, is not based on appearance, is not including the face, is organized around other features. And the features are sufficient, are adequate, are creating stable selfhood without the visual component. And the component is what the experiment removed, is what the conditions eliminated, is what revealed the contingency of self-recognition, the learned nature of face identity, the cultural foundation of the visual self. And the self that forms without mirrors is coherent, is functional, is demonstrating that appearance is not essential to selfhood, that the face is not necessary for identity, that recognition is not natural, but is learned, is acquired, is the product of reflection, of mediation, of the external surfaces that show what cannot be seen directly, and the directly is what the children knew themselves, is how they experienced being, is the proprioceptive, the auditory, the tactile, the ways of knowing that do not require reflection, that do not depend on mirrors, that are available without mediation, and the mediation is what the visual requires, is what the face needs, is what makes self-recognition possible, and the possible is what the experiment showed to be contingent, to be cultural, to be the result of. Conditions that can be present or absent, and the absence creates different selves, creates identities without faces, creates children who know themselves but do not recognize themselves, who are themselves but do not appear to be themselves, who exist as subjects but not as visual objects. And the objects are what mirrors create, are what reflections produce, are what the external mediation makes available, and the available is what these children lacked, is what the experiment withheld, is what created the conditions where self-recognition could not develop, where the face remained unknown, where identity formed without the visual self, and the self was complete, was intact, was not diminished but was different, was showing that the mirror is not reflecting what is there but is creating what is recognized, is producing the visual self, is making the face part of identity, and identity is flexible, is variable, is forming around whatever is available, whatever is provided, whatever is repeated enough to become integrated. And the integrated is what the visual self is in normal conditions, is what the face becomes through reflection, is what mirrors produce. But the production is not automatic, is not guaranteed, is not happening without the conditions, without the exposure, without the repeated pairing that creates recognition. And recognition is what makes the face mine, is what integrates appearance into identity, is what connects the image to the self. And the connection is learned, is cultural, is showing that selfhood is not given but is made, is not discovered but is constructed, is not natural but is the product of specific conditions, specific technologies, specific cultural practices, and the practices include mirrors, include reflections, include the constant availability of surfaces that show the face, and the face is what becomes known through showing, is what becomes self through reflection, is what becomes mine through recognition, and recognition requires mirrors, requires surfaces, requires the external mediation that these children lacked, that the experiment withheld, that created the conditions where identity formed without the visual self, where the face remained other, where self-recognition was absent, and the absence was revealing, was demonstrating, was showing that the self is not what it seems, is not naturally visual, is not automatically including the face, but is constructed through reflection, through mediation, through the mirrors that create the visual self, that integrate appearance into identity, that make recognition possible. And the possible is what these children lacked, is what the experiment removed, is what revealed that the face is not naturally known, that self-recognition is not automatic, that identity requires reflection, requires mirrors, requires the external surfaces that show what cannot be seen directly, and the directly is what matters, is what is felt, is what is known without mediation. And the mediation is what creates the visual, is what produces the face, is what makes self-recognition possible. And the possible is contingent, is cultural, is the product of mirrors, of reflections, of the external mediation that shows the face and creates the connection. And the connection is what these children lacked, is what the experiment prevented, is what revealed that selfhood is learned, that identity is constructed, that the face is not naturally part of self, but is integrated through reflection, through mirrors, through the mediated surfaces that show what the eyes cannot see, and the seeing is what creates recognition, is what produces the visual self, is what makes the face mine, and mine is what the face was not for these children, was not in images, was not in reflections, was not recognized because recognition requires mirrors, requires reflection, requires the external mediation that creates the visual self, that integrates appearance into identity, that makes selfhood include the face. And the face is what these children never knew, never saw, never recognized. And the recognizing is what mirrors do, is what reflection creates, is what the experiment showed to be learned, to be cultural, to be contingent on conditions that can be present or absent. And the absence creates different selves, creates identities without faces, creates children who are themselves but do not know themselves visually, who exist but do not recognize themselves, who have faces but have never seen them. And the seeing is what makes the face part of self, is what creates recognition, is what mirrors produce, and mirrors are what the children lacked, are what the experiment withheld, are what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, requires mediation, requires the surfaces that show the face and create the visual self, and the self that forms without this reflection is different, is not including appearance, is not based on face, is organized around other ways of knowing, other modes of awareness, and the awareness is sufficient, is creating stable identity, is demonstrating that the visual self is not essential, is not necessary, is not the foundation of selfhood, but is one component, one way of knowing, one mode of recognition. And recognition is what mirrors create, is what reflection produces, is what these children lacked, and the lacking revealed that selfhood is learned, that identity is constructed, that the face is not naturally part of self, but becomes part through reflection, through mirrors, through the external mediation that shows what cannot be seen directly. And the directly is what the children knew, is how they existed, is the selfhood without the visual. And the visual is what requires mirrors, requires reflection, requires the external surfaces that create recognition, that integrate appearance, that make the face part of identity. And identity is what forms without mirrors. When mirrors are absent, when reflection is unavailable, when the conditions prevent the development of visual self-recognition, and the recognition is absent, is not developed, is showing that the self does not require the face, that identity does not need appearance, that selfhood can form without the visual component, and the component is what mirrors create, is what reflection produces, is what the experiment showed to be contingent, to be learned, to be the product of external mediation. And mediation is what creates the visual self, what integrates the face, what makes self-recognition possible. And the possible is what these children lacked, is what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, requires mirrors, requires the surfaces that show the face and create the connection between image and self. And the connection is learned, is cultural, is not automatic, is not natural, is the product of repeated exposure to reflection, to the mirrors that make the face known, that integrate appearance into identity, that create the visual self, and the self without this integration is different, is coherent, is stable, is demonstrating that selfhood is flexible, is constructed, is forming around whatever is available, and what was available to these children was everything except mirrors, except reflection, except the visual self. And the visual self is what requires external mediation, what depends on mirrors, what these children never developed because they never saw themselves, never knew their faces, never recognized themselves in images, and the images are what others use to identify them, what the culture assumes to be natural, what the experiment showed to be learned, to be cultural, to be contingent on mirrors, on reflection, on the external surfaces that create the visual self, that integrate appearance into identity, that make self-recognition possible. And the possible is what the experiment removed, is what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, that the face is not naturally known, that self-recognition is learned, is cultural, is the product of mirrors, and mirrors are what create the visual self, what make the face part of identity, what these children lacked and the lacking revealed. That selfhood without mirrors is different, is possible, is coherent, is demonstrating that the self does not require reflection to exist, only to be recognized visually. And visual recognition is what mirrors create, what these children never achieved, what the experiment showed to be contingent, cultural, learned, and learned is what self-recognition is, what the face becomes, what identity includes when mirrors are present, when reflection is available, when external mediation creates the visual self, and the self is what these children had without it, is what formed differently, is what demonstrated that identity formation requires external reflection only if visual self-recognition is the goal. And the goal is cultural, is modern, is contingent on mirrors. And mirrors are what these children lacked, are what the experiment removed, are what revealed that selfhood is flexible, is constructed, is formed around whatever is reflected back. And what was reflected back was nothing, was absence, was the lack of visual self, and the lack created different identity, created selfhood without face, created children who couldn't recognize themselves, because identity formation requires external reflection, requires mirrors, requires the surfaces that show the face and create the visual self, and the visual self is what these children never developed, never knew, never integrated into identity, and identity was different, was complete, was demonstrating that the self does not require the face to be the self, only to recognize the self visually. And visual recognition requires mirrors, requires reflection, requires external mediation, and mediation is what the experiment removed, is what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, that selfhood includes the face only when mirrors are present, that self-recognition is learned, is cultural, is contingent, and contingent is what the visual self is, what the face is, what recognition is, and recognition is what these children lacked, is what mirrors create, is what the experiment showed to require external reflection, and reflection is what makes identity include the face, what makes selfhood visual, what makes the self recognizable. And recognizable is what these children were not to themselves, were not in images, were not in mirrors when mirrors were finally shown. And the showing did not create recognition, because recognition requires learning, requires pairing, requires the repeated exposure that these children never had. And the never having revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, that the face is learned, that self-recognition is cultural, that mirrors create the visual self, and the visual self is what these children never developed, never knew, never became, and became is what they were without it, were different selves, were identities without faces, were children who couldn't recognize themselves, because identity formation requires external reflection, requires mirrors, requires the surfaces that create recognition, and recognition is what mirrors make, what reflection produces, what these children lacked, and the lacking revealed the truth, revealed the contingency, revealed that identity formation requires external reflection. Memory is not a gift, but a burden, not the preservation of experience, but its prolongation, not the recording of the past, but its endless present tense replay. And this replay is what makes trauma permanent, what makes suffering extend beyond its moment, what converts a single event into a lifetime of pain, because the event is not just remembered, but is relived, it is re-experienced in the body, in the nervous system, in the patterns of activation that do not distinguish between then and now, between memory and occurrence, between representation and reality, and so the past remains present, remains active, remains capable of causing suffering long after the original threat has passed, long after the danger is over, long after any adaptive function of remembering could be served. And this persistence raises the question of whether some memories should be erased, whether some experiences should be forgotten, whether the technology that is emerging that promises to selectively delete traumatic memories while leaving other memories intact should be used, should be embraced, should be offered to those whose lives are destroyed by memories. They cannot escape, cannot integrate, cannot survive, and the survival is what is at stake, is what makes the question urgent. Because some memories are incompatible with living, are producing symptoms that are unbearable, are creating suffering so severe that the person carrying the memory would choose non-existence over continued remembering. And the choices being made is visible in suicide rates, in substance abuse, in all the ways that people try to escape memories that will not let them go. And the letting go is what forgetting would provide, is what erasure would accomplish, is the liberation from the past that therapy tries to achieve, but often fails to deliver. Because therapy works with memory, works through memory, tries to integrate the traumatic experience into narrative, into meaning, into the story of the self. But some experiences resist integration, resist meaning, resist becoming part of any story except the story of horror, of violation, of the destruction of everything that makes life livable. And when integration fails, when meaning cannot be found, when the memory remains as intrusive, as overwhelming, as fragmenting as it was at the moment of encoding, then what is the ethical response? Is it to insist that the person continue carrying the memory, continue suffering from it, continue being destroyed by it? Or is it to offer erasure, to provide the technology that could remove the memory, could delete the trace, could free the person from the past? And the freedom is what erasure promises, is what makes it appealing, is what drives the development of techniques that can target specific memories, that can identify the neural patterns associated with traumatic experiences and disrupt them, prevent them from reconsolidating, make them inaccessible. And the inaccessibility is forgetting, is the functional equivalent of the memory never having been formed. And if the memory was never formed, then the trauma never happened. Not in the sense that the event did not occur, but in the sense that it is not remembered, is not present, is not continuing to shape experience. And the shaping is what memory does, is how the past influences the present. And if the influence is removed, then the past is effectively erased, is no longer part of the person's life, is no longer determining their responses, their possibilities, their sense of who they are. And the who they are is the problem, is the question that erasure raises. Because if identity is constituted by memory, if the self is the narrative constructed from experiences, then what happens to identity when memories are deleted, when experiences are removed, when the continuity is broken? And the continuity is what makes the self feel stable, feel coherent, feel like the same person over time. And if memories are erased, then the person who emerges is not the same person, is someone different, is someone who did not have those experiences, who was not shaped by that trauma, who does not carry that pain. And this difference is what makes erasure controversial, is what raises the ethical question of whether it is right to change someone's identity, to make them into someone else, even if that someone else would suffer less, would function better, would have a life that is livable. Because the life that is livable is not the life of the person who chose erasure, is the life of a different person, a person who is created by the deletion of memory. And creation through deletion is strange, is unsettling, is raising questions about what it means to be the same person, what continuity consists of, what identity requires, and the requirements are not clear, are disputed, are the subject of philosophical debate that has no resolution. Because some theories say that identity requires psychological continuity, requires that there be a chain of memories connecting present self to past self. And if that chain is broken, if memories are deleted, then continuity is lost, identity is disrupted. The person who exists after erasure is not the same person who existed before, and this non-sameness is either a problem or a solution depending on perspective, depending on whether identity is valued more than well-being, whether continuity is more important than happiness, whether the integrity of the self matters more than the quality of experience, and the quality of experience is what suffers under traumatic memory, is what is destroyed by intrusive recollections, is what makes life unbearable for those who cannot forget. And if they cannot forget naturally, then perhaps they should be allowed to forget artificially, to choose erasure, to opt for the deletion of memories that are destroying them. And the destruction is real, is measurable, is visible in brain scans, in stress hormone levels, in all the biomarkers of chronic suffering. And the suffering is not ennobling, is not making people stronger, is not serving any purpose except to demonstrate that memory can be prison, can be torture, can be the mechanism through which the past destroys the present. And the destruction is what erasure would prevent, is what deletion would stop, is what forgetting would accomplish. And the accomplishing is mercy, is compassion, is the recognition that some memories are too heavy to carry, are too painful to bear, are incompatible with survival, and survival is what matters, is what should be prioritized, is what justifies intervention, justifies technology, justifies the manipulation of memory that would once have been considered impossible, unthinkable, unethical, but is now possible, is now real, is now raising questions that must be answered about who decides, about what criteria are used, about whether erasure should be available to anyone who wants it or only to those whose suffering meets some threshold. And the threshold is where the difficulty lies, is where the ethics become complicated, because if erasure is available only for the most severe trauma, then who decides what counts as severe enough? And if it is available to anyone, then what prevents its misuse? What prevents people from erasing memories that are uncomfortable but not traumatic, that are painful but not disabling, that are part of the normal range of human experience and should perhaps be integrated rather than deleted? And the integration is what traditional approaches emphasize, is what therapy aims for, is the incorporation of difficult experiences into a coherent narrative, into a sense of self that includes the trauma but is not defined by it. But this incorporation is not always possible, is not always achievable, is requiring resources and time and capacity that not everyone has. And even when it is achieved, it is not always sufficient, is not always eliminating the suffering, is not always making the memory tolerable. And when integration fails, then what? Is the person simply condemned to suffer? Condemned to carry the memory forever? Condemned to be destroyed by an experience that happened once but is replaying endlessly? And the endless is what memory makes possible, is the way that a single event can become a lifetime of suffering. And if that suffering can be prevented, can be eliminated, can be stopped through the deletion of memory, then why should it not be? What principle is more important than the relief of suffering? What value trumps the well-being of the person who is being destroyed by memory? And the destruction is not metaphorical, is literal, is the disintegration of functioning, of relationships, of the capacity to live. And if erasure can prevent this disintegration, then perhaps it should be used, perhaps it should be offered, perhaps it should be normalized rather than stigmatized. But the stigma is real, is coming from multiple directions, from those who believe that memory is essential to identity and should not be tampered with, from those who worry about slippery slopes and unintended consequences, from those who insist that suffering has meaning and should be endured rather than erased. And the meaning is what is most disputed, is what is most questioned, because the claim that suffering has meaning is easy to make from a position of safety, from a position of not suffering, from a position of having integrated one's own traumas, or never having experienced trauma severe enough to be unintegrable. But for those who are suffering, for those who are being destroyed, the meaning is not visible, is not accessible, is not providing any comfort or purpose or reason to continue. And the continue is what is in question, is what is at stake, is why erasure might be necessary, might be ethical, might be the right choice. Despite all the concerns about identity and continuity and the sanctity of memory, because memory is not sacred, is not inherently valuable, is only valuable insofar as it serves life. And when it does not serve life, when it destroys life, when it makes life unbearable, then its value is negative, is harmful, is justifying intervention. And intervention is what erasure is the technological manipulation of memory for therapeutic purposes. And the therapeutic is what justifies it, is what makes it ethical, is the goal of reducing suffering, of improving functioning, of making life livable for those for whom it is currently unlivable. And the unlivable is the condition that justifies extreme measures, that justifies technologies that would otherwise be considered too risky, too invasive, too potentially harmful, because the harm of doing nothing is greater than the harm of erasure, is greater than the risk of identity disruption, is greater than any abstract concern about the sanctity of memory. And the sanctity is the appeal to tradition, is the insistence that things should be done the way they have always been done, that memory should not be manipulated, that the past should be accepted rather than edited. But this traditionalism is not serving those who are suffering, is not helping those who are being destroyed, is only protecting an ideal, a concept, a belief that memory is essential to being human. And maybe it is, maybe memory is what makes humans human, but maybe humans would be better off with less memory, with more forgetting, with the capacity to let go of experiences that serve no purpose except to create suffering. And the capacity is what technology is providing, is what erasure makes possible, is the choice to forget, to let go, to be free from the past, and the freedom is what matters, is what should be prioritized, is what makes erasure not just permissible, but perhaps obligatory, perhaps something that should be offered, should be encouraged, should be made available to all who need it, because the need is great, is widespread, is affecting millions who are living with memories they cannot escape, cannot integrate, cannot survive. And the survival is what is at stake, is what makes this an urgent question. Not an abstract philosophical puzzle, but a practical ethical dilemma with real consequences for real people who are suffering now, who need relief now, who cannot wait for therapy to work or for time to heal or for meaning to emerge from their trauma. Because for many, the meaning never emerges. The healing never happens. The suffering never ends, except through death or erasure. And if erasure can prevent death, then it is the ethical choice, is the compassionate choice, is the choice that prioritizes the person over the principle, the individual over the ideal, the actual suffering over the abstract concern. And the concern about identity is legitimate, is real, is raising important questions about what continuity means and whether it can be preserved through erasure. But these questions are secondary to the question of survival, are less urgent than the question of whether the person can continue living with the memory. And if they cannot, then the questions about identity become moot, become irrelevant, because identity requires existence, and existence requires tolerability, and tolerability requires that memory not be destroying the person. And if it is destroying the person, then erasure is justified, is necessary, is the intervention that should be used. And the using is not a failure of courage or resilience or meaning-making, is not an admission of weakness, is not a refusal to integrate or endure, is simply the recognition that some experiences are too much, are beyond what can be borne, are incompatible with living. And when living is the goal, then erasure is the means, is the technology that makes it possible, is the mercy that medicine can provide. And the providing is ethics, is compassion, is the appropriate response to suffering that is otherwise unrelievable. And the unrelievable is what makes memory torture in some cases, is what makes the past a prison, is what makes forgetting not a failure, but a necessity, not a loss, but a gain, not the destruction of identity, but its salvation, because identity requires a living person, and living requires that trauma not be replaying constantly, not be fragmenting consciousness, not be making every moment unbearable. And the unbearable is what memory makes possible, is what remembering produces is the cost of consciousness that includes memory, and maybe some things should not be remembered, should not be preserved, should not be allowed to continue shaping experience. And the shaping is what memory does, is how the past influences the present. And if that influence is destructive, then it should be stopped, should be interrupted, should be erased. And the erasing is what technology now allows, is what ethics should permit, is what compassion demands. Because the alternative is continued suffering, is the ongoing destruction of people by their own memories, is the insistence that they carry burdens that no one should have to carry, that serve no purpose, that make no meaning, that produce only pain, and the pain is enough, is sufficient reason to intervene, is justification for erasure, for deletion, for the right to forget, for the mercy of amnesia, for the liberation from memory that is prison, that is torture. That is the mechanism through which trauma becomes permanent. And the permanent is what should be ended, is what technology can end, is what ethics should permit ending. Because memory is not sacred, identity is not absolute, continuity is not more important than survival, and survival is what erasure makes possible, is what forgetting provides, is what some people need in order to live. And the living is what matters, is what should be protected, is what justifies the technology, justifies the intervention, justifies the choice to erase, to forget, to let go of the past, to be freed from memory, to be given the mercy of amnesia. And the mercy is real, is powerful, is the gift of forgetting what should never have happened, what should never have been remembered, what should never have been allowed to destroy a life. And the destruction is what erasure prevents, is what forgetting stops, is what makes the ethics clear, makes the choice obvious, makes the answer yes. Some memories should be erased, should be deleted, should be forgotten, because memory is not always gift, is sometimes curse, is sometimes the thing that destroys rather than preserves, that harms rather than helps, that makes life unbearable rather than meaningful. And when memory is cursed, then erasure is cure, is treatment, is the ethical response to suffering that has no other solution. And the solution is forgetting, is amnesia, is the right to oblivion, is the choice to let the past go, to be freed from its weight, to live without the burden of memories that serve no purpose except to create pain. And the pain is enough, is reason enough, is justification enough for erasure, for deletion, for the technology that makes forgetting possible, that makes mercy achievable, that makes liberation from memory real. And the real is what matters, is what should guide ethics, is what should determine whether erasure is used. And the determination is clear, is obvious, is yes, for those who need it, for those who are suffering, for those whose memories are destroying them. Erasure should be available, should be offered, should be used, because memory is not sacred, suffering is not meaningful. The past is not worth preserving when it destroys the present, and the present is all there is all that matters, is what should be protected, even if protection requires forgetting, even if survival requires erasure, even if living requires the deletion of memory, because living is what matters, is what ethics serves, is what makes erasure not just permissible, but necessary, not just acceptable, but obligatory, not just an option, but the right choice, the ethical choice, the compassionate choice, the choice that prioritizes people over principles, individuals over ideals, actual lives over abstract concerns. And the concerns are real, but are secondary, are less important than the suffering, less urgent than the need, less compelling than the possibility of relief. And the relief is what erasure provides, is what forgetting offers, is what amnesia delivers. And the delivery is mercy, is compassion, is ethics in action, is the appropriate response to suffering that can be prevented, to pain that can be stopped, to memories that can be erased, and should be erased, and will be erased, because the technology exists, because the need is real, because the suffering is unbearable, and the unbearable should not be borne when it can be lifted, when it can be removed, when it can be erased. And the erasing is not loss but gain, not harm but healing, not destruction but salvation, not the end of identity but its continuation. Because identity requires life, and life requires that memory not be weapon, not be prison, not be torture. And when memory is these things, then erasure is the answer, is the solution, is the mercy that makes. Living possible, and the possible, is what matters, is what ethics serves, is what makes forgetting not failure, but wisdom, not weakness, but strength, not escape, but survival. And survival is enough, is sufficient, is the justification for erasure, for deletion, for the right to forget, for the mercy of amnesia, for the ethics of forgetting.